we're going to refresh your memory on writing some equations of line. So we're going to do this in slope-intercept form, y equals mx plus b. And remember that m stands for the slope of your line, and b is the y-intercept. So if I know the slope of my line is -1/2 on this one, I'm going to start by plugging that in. And then I'm still going to need to solve for my y-intercept. But I can use the point that I have, -2, 5, to plug in an x and y value in my equation, and then I'll be able to solve for b. My y value is 5, so I'm going to plug that in, and then that equals -1/2 times my x value of -2 plus b. If I multiply -1/2 times -2, I get 1, and then subtracting 1 from both sides gives me a y-intercept of 4. So if you put it all back together, you have y equals -1/2 x plus 4. Let's do one where you only have 2 points. So this time you have to calculate your own slope. So there's a few different ways you might be familiar with. You can think of slope as rise over run, which is really the change in your your y values, over the change in your x values. That triangle means change in. It's Greek letter delta. Or you're probably most familiar with like y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. So if I plug in my y values, 2 minus -4, and then my x values on bottom, make sure that you keep the same order on top and bottom. I start with the y value from one point on top. I need to start with that x value on bottom. So it doesn't matter which point you start with, but you do need to be consistent and subtract in the same order in the numerator and denominator. So that gives me -6/5 x plus b, which, like before, I'm going to need to find my y-intercept. I can use either of my 2 points to plug in an xy pair. You just can't mix and match them and take like one x from one and one y from the other. I'm going to use -3, 2. So I'll plug in 2 for y and -3 for x. And then solve for my y-intercept. If you multiply -6/5 times -3, you get +18 over 5. And then I like to go ahead and get a common denominator. So if you multiply 2 by 5 over 5, you get 10/5. And then when you subtract, it's easier because you already have a common denominator. So you'll end up with -8/5 for b. Put it all back together, you get y equals -6/5 x minus 8/5. We're going to write some equations for some horizontal and vertical lines. I like to draw a little sketch of these. It makes it kind of easier to think about. So if I want a horizontal line that goes through the point 3, -7, think about the other points on that line. You've got like -3, -7, 0, -7. So the y value for all those points is -7. So the equation for the line is just y equals -7. If we do a vertical one through that same point, think about points along that line. We've got like 3, 1, 3, 7. All of those points have x values of 3, so that vertical line is just x equals 3. Let's take this graph and find our slope, x, and y-intercept. So first off for slope, if you can find like 2 points that fall on grid lines, like I could go from my y-intercept up to and to the right 3 to get to a nice whole grid line point. I think there's a word for that, but the slope is rise over run, so that would be 2/3. You could also use the delta y over delta x, fancy new notation. Now your x-intercept, where it crosses the x-axis, is the point -3, 0, and your y-intercept is the point 0, 2. So if I want to write an equation for my line in slope-intercept form, I'll do y equals mx plus b, so 2/3 x plus my y-intercept, you can see, is 2. So a brief little refresher about parallel lines. Parallel lines never intersect. They have the same slopes, like y equals 2x minus 5 and y equals 2x would be parallel. Perpendicular lines meet at a 90-degree angle. Their slopes have opposite signs, so like one positive, one negative, and they are reciprocals of each other. So let's write some equations. I want a line that goes through the point 3, 5 and is parallel to 2x plus 5y equals 4. So I need to figure out the slope of 2x plus 5y equals 4 because my line that's parallel to it is going to have the same slope. So let's put that one in slope-intercept form. Subtract 2x from both sides, divide by 5. and you'll get y equals negative 2/5 x plus 4/5. So my slope of my original line is negative 2/5, and the slope of my new parallel line is going to be the same thing, so also negative 2/5. Now, just like I've been doing all along, I need my y-intercept, so I'm going to plug in my x and y value and solve for b, which gives you 5 equals negative 2/5 times 3 plus b. Multiply those together, get a common denominator, add 6/5 to both sides, and you end up with 31/5 for your y-intercept. So y equals negative 2/5 x plus 31/5. Now the only real difference on b is that it is supposed to be perpendicular to that same line, which means instead of having the same slope as my original line, my slope is going to have the opposite sign and be the reciprocal of my original slope. So if my original slope was negative 2/5, then the slope of the line perpendicular to it is going to be positive 5/2. So plug that in, and then again need my y-intercept, so plug in x and y and solve for it. And I'm not even going to narrate this because you're probably tired of hearing me do the same thing, so I sped it up. You guys know what to do. When we get all said and done, you get negative 5/2 for your y-intercept. Horizontal and vertical lines are a little bit different to think about. I like to sketch them. So if I need a line that's parallel to y equals negative 3, and it's supposed to go through negative 5/2, well, parallel to that line is another horizontal line. And the line that I've got has to go through negative 5/2, so it has y values of 2. If I want a line that goes through 7, -1, it's perpendicular to x equals 6, well, it's going to meet in a 90-degree angle, and that means it's going to be a horizontal line to be perpendicular to my vertical line. And then my horizontal line there would consist of all the points with y values of -1. So this is a little bit different. I'm trying to find w, which is the x-coordinate of a point. And what I need is to find a w value so that my line passing through those 2 points is parallel to 3y plus 2x equals 6. So it needs to have the same slope as 3y plus 2x equals 6. So let's figure out that slope. That slope is negative 2/3. And now I've got 2 points, and the slope that my line passing through them needs to have. So let's set that negative 2/3 equal to my slope calculation formula. So if I plug in my y values of -1 and 2, and then on bottom, my x values of 4 and w, then that should equal my slope of negative 2/3. So let's solve for w. Well, I have 4 minus my variable that I'm solving for in the denominator. So I went ahead and subtracted -1 and -2. I'm going to have to multiply to get that out of the denominator. So let's multiply by 4 minus w over 1 on both sides, which is going to give me -2 times 4 minus w over 3 equals just -3. And if you multiply that -2 in, you get -8 plus 2w over 3 equals -3. I'm going to multiply both sides times 3. There's multiple ways you could solve this equation. And that'll give you -8 plus 2w equals -9. Add 8 to both sides, divide by 2, and you end up with w equals -1/2. Perpendicular would be similar, but you'd have to do opposite reciprocal for your slope that you're setting it equal to instead.